What we see now when we look at lots of data about human flourishing, it really does come down to his magnum opus of his life was to look at the rise and fall of civilizations, Assyria, Babylon, Greece, Rome, European empires. And then you saw this rise in development, prosperity, creativity, innovation. And at the peak of it, he would say, in every case, it was the orientation of that society to the nurturing of children. What? David Brooks at the New York Times, for him, it was such an awakening. I've reached the top of the ladder in the meritocracy culture, and sensing the emptiness, the loss. He said, I want to take people by the lapels and say, do not.
Wow.
The single strongest discriminator in happiness in the United States between those who are happy and those who are not is marital status.
Oh my gosh, that is like beautiful. Welcome to Amai, where you belong as a mother.
What's interesting is I think men have increased their time of engagement at home, and that's a good thing. There's lots of research that suggests more equal partnership facilitates happier marriages, facilitates happier women.
Right.
Now the problem is, or that you're, I think, wondering about, right, based on this shift, is we would say we've taken on a careerist or a workist orientation to life, which is career then moved from being what men did to earn money to provide to being an identity, a status, a calling in one's life. Now, this is not working class families who are trying to get hourly wages. This is right, educated people who now see, and women, right, like, I'm pursuing a career because of what it means to my identity.
Yes.
And not inherently bad. The problem is we have shifted from a familist orientation to a workist orientation, that the defining goodness of life is found in achievement.
And in the individual instead of the family
in
unit.
The individual, right? And so what I would say from my research is when you look at the epidemic of loneliness, when you look at the increase of mental health challenges, when you look at the pervasive sense of loss of identity, loss of meaning, it is 1,000% grounded in loss of core relationships. So when we lose kind of core identity bound up in the strength of people who need and belong and care for one another, we have dehumanized the nature of human beings. We've lost it because we really are deeply relational at our core.
Yes, fundamentally. From how we interact and how we have been created.
Yes. And we can see that across life. So I think it's interesting when we think about that relational reality of human beings and shifting to an individual, autonomous, that the peak kind of, the peak of a successful individual is someone who's able to at will pursue what they want for pleasure. That's kind of what we idealize.
Right.
At the, we just said Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a pyramid.
At the very top, yes.
Right. And I think what we're realizing is human beings and their flourishing and well-being is much more like a tree. It's bound up in strong relationships, identity from roots, connection to other human beings, and that human flourishing is really about the strength of the web of connections that we belong to in a very paradoxical way.
Yes. And that's a beautiful analogy, because when we're looking at individuals, it's like we don't exist in silos.
Yes.
In any part of human behavior. There's nothing.
No development that we have, right?
Ever has existed separate from other human beings.
Yes.
And so I think that is such a better analogy to show that.
Our relational. So there's this it's the longest study in history. It's called the Harvard Grant Study, 75 years in length. Oh. It took a class from Harvard their freshman year. It was John F. Kennedy's class, and it literally tracked almost everything you could measure about human beings. A lot about their physical, length of the nose, even the shape of the head, because at the time there was a very Darwinist orientation in the 1930s, and so it was very physical oriented, but also relational, IQ, relations of home, right? And they tracked these men because there were no women in that class. They tracked these men for 75 years. They're still tracking 80 years. And
Wow.
they have passed away, but now they're looking at the second generation. But at the end of the study, $20 million, $25 million, this remarkable study, they're looking at what is it that's core to human flourishing. And George Vaillant ends the study with these words: happiness is love, full stop. And as he's looking at what predicted their well-being in adulthood, healthy aging, what predicted their ability to earn money, what predicted the happiness measures, it was all relationships from the beginning of life to the end of life.
To the end. Wow. And here I feel like in our society, there's this attitude of I can do it on my own. I'm independent. I'm going through life on my own. I mean, there's lots of movements in many regards. It's like, I don't need relationships. I don't need a spouse or a partner or kids or this. And it's like, ooh. And what you're telling me is this study is showing the exact opposite. Is if you want genuine fulfillment and happiness, it comes down to relationships.
Yes, that is right. And that human beings we are hardwired to connect, to bond, and that our flourishing really depends on strong webs of connection that begin with those core relationships. So as we've watched, 1960s, 1970s, we would say the late 1960s, you had this shift in the definition of marriage, partly because of changes in divorce laws, partly because of what we would call the sexual revolution for women, which was in order to be liberated, women needed access to contraception and abortion, which then shifted how we engage sexually with men. Previous to that, a man would say, I want to engage sexually with you. And she'd say, well, you need to be marriageable.
Yes. There has to be a standard that you're going to get because I need that security.
You're exactly right. And so
the sexual revolution ended up just obliterating that
totally
standard.
Changing that. That's right. And so now what we had across the 70s was a dramatic increase in the divorce rate, like a tremendous increase. So it would have been maybe 10% to 40% of first marriages. And that's over like a 15-year period. So really dramatic increase.
Very, very short time.
Yes.
Wow, I did not realize it was in that amount of time.
So then you have a disruption in kind of family stability, many more children growing up with a single mom and
dad not present,
father
in the
not
home,
connected. And so I think what we see now when we look at lots of data about human flourishing, it really does come down to the strength of core relationships being fundamental to human well-being.
Wow. And I hope people can realize that before it's too late, right? Because now people are saying fulfillment and happiness and everything comes from an easy, like they're solving for easy and comfortable.
Yes.
And that's the default. As long as as long as life isn't too hard and I don't have too many challenges, like it should be good, right?
Yes.
And as long as I'm, it's a comfortable and easy lifestyle, I should be happy, right? And I think we're realizing, no, you're not fulfilled. You're not fulfilled without those meaningful, deep relationships. And I do believe that we can have deep relationships in many regards, but can you talk specifically to family relationships? And how different that is? Because I know a lot of people, it's like, I'll just make sure I have a lot of really close friends. And that's great. But there is something different with the family unit and the ties that are built within that.
Yeah, a couple quick thoughts. One is, as you were talking about happiness, right? It's interesting that the researcher Baumeister, who does quite a bit on like well-being, and in much of our research, we use the question, are you satisfied, right? How satisfied are you with your life? Okay. And he'll find out that the strongest predictor of kind of really well-being is going to be meaning as opposed to happiness.
That's a really good definition change. Yeah. Like, are you finding meaning in your life?
Then human beings are feeling like, right, life is meaningful. It's doing what it's intended to do. And so the pain-free existence that like the ego is excited about pursuing can leave us empty. Right? And so he's going to find out what human beings really want is meaning. So that leads us to family relationships, right? Because I think just starting out from the beginnings of life, there's no question we're relational. If we just look at an infant's first task, which is they have to. They're going to be sleeping and eating and needing nourishment, but they have to establish a bond of connection.
Yeah.
Yes.
That attachment.
They have to. And so they come out, and I think for a long time we just thought, oh, they're sleeping and eating and pooping,
This
and
is what they're doing.
And now we can see their effort to engage, to reach out to, excuse me, to connect with other human beings. Mm-hmm. And they're going to be primed from birth to reach out to a particular human being.
Okay. To have that secure relationship with one specific caregiver, you're saying.
That's exactly right. And so across species, it's going to be that mother, right? And we all know that, right? That infant emerges from the womb. They know her heartbeat. They know her smell. They know her voice.
And they have literally been connected, tied together through an umbilical cord.
Yes. Yes. It's unbelievably powerful. I think that's what women sense, right? Is there is something very powerful about this connection. And you're right. Her brain, her body, her bones, her blood have built this infant
child.
So it's fascinating. In the last few years, we can now see that the cells of the infant's body that are neutrophilic, they aren't fully developed, right? You have like a new developing human being.
Embryo. Okay, yeah.
That those cells they'll remain, some of those cells will remain in her body, that mother's body, for the rest of her life.
Whoa.
So they can see that a woman's heart that goes under stress, because during pregnancy where there's so much blood flow, that can be a stressful thing on a mother's heart. It's like the infant senses it, and their underdeveloped cells or less developed cells will beeline it to the heart and help the strengthen the heart of that mother.
Oh my gosh, that is like beautiful.
Isn't that so beautiful and powerful?
That is beautiful. And they've just recently discovered that this is...
Last few years, yes. I think with more technology where we can see things more, what's going on.
That's amazing.
So it's a deeply intimate connection, right? And it's not just genetic, that's powerful, but it's the space in which that life grows and develops. And so this infant really emerges with a desire to connect with mother. Wow. And we find all the hormonal connections going on, a flood of oxytocin in the process of giving birth and delivering baby.
Yes, and that's the connection hormone.
That's the bonding hormone. Yes. And then in breastfeeding, a flood of oxytocin. And what it appears to do physiologically is elicit behaviors like cooing and cuddling that draw the mother eye to eye to that infant, body to body, hands on that body, and a cooing and a cuddling kind of behavior that really is impactful in terms of strengthening the emotional connection
with that child. Wow.
And I think, John Bowlby, who created attachment theory in the 1940s, people could see, and Mary Ainsworth, who tested it extensively, and she was able to see that maternal sensitivity is very important, meaning the way the mother relates to that infant, the bond that they form, whether it's secure or avoidant or anxious, is going to set kind of a relational trajectory for that child.
And like long-term too, if you don't do something about it.
There was no question there's something powerful about this bond. And it seems to, attachment theorists would see, it does set a trajectory. It doesn't mean that it can't be overcome if the bond was not formed or if it was an anxious, or an insecure attachment, but it's very significant. And now what we can see is, because of technology that allows us to actually look at the brain, for a long time, I think people thought this is a left brain thing going on. She's developing language skills and their ability to understand. And now we know in that first year, it is almost exclusively right brain to right brain, which is the center for emotional regulation, well-being, identity, who I am, not the language side, not even the creative side. It's
much deeper than that.
It's deeper than that. That's right, Aurora. And so A Theory of Love, a book written by Berkeley scholars, will say literally in that first 2 years, they communicate through the language of love. That's the language they call it. That isn't about words. It's not about ideas. It's more fundamental than that. It is a regulating of the emotions of that infant. She's matching the infant's inner state and upregulating it and doing all of the emotion regulation that the infant cannot yet do for themselves.
Wow.
That then sort of lays this really important foundation
for this child.
Yes.
Wow. That's so powerful.
It is so powerful. And it's not, I think what's amazing, this is not women who have a PhD in how to respond to infants. This is like intuitive, remarkable, physiologically shaped way of literally giving just the right chunked bits, they call it, of stimulation needed to build the right brain of that baby. And if she gives too much, she intuitively pulls back, right? Because the infant will need to look at her and then look away as they're developing, right? A sense of self and other and connection, and all of this kind of groundwork is being laid in the power of this relationship. And I think women sense it, right?
Yes.
They can sense, and it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's like, I remember that first weeks, I could not shut off LaDawn's crying. I couldn't not respond. I'd been 35 years independent, and now I am so connected to this little person. Cannot not respond.
Yes.
That's an overwhelming
feeling.
Yes. Responsibility, right?
Yes.
There's no question. It is huge. It's bigger than any of us are.
Yes. And it changes us.
It changes us
as beings. Can you tell us a little bit about what happens to a mom in that regard?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, we know, and I should say, fathers, I think we are understanding better than ever how fathers impact development. And so I think for a long time we've understood there's no question
motherhood. Yes.
There is something unspeakably powerful about what I'm observing in this mother and infant, their connection and relationship. But fathers are very, very important as well. Now, having said that, there's a different bond that's being formed, that father-infant and mother-infant.
Yes.
And I think what we can see is she is building core sense of security. She will be the person that child will go to. Mothers have across their life for emotional support, typically.
Yes.
And that's not in every case, but far more typically, it's a mother that child will go to for
the emotional
feelings.
Yes.
And mothers seem to have more capacity to regulate their emotions. They express their emotions more strongly than men do. Other than anger, women tend less toward anger than men. That's more of an automatic response in men. But they express their emotions, other than anger, more strongly than men. But they also have more capacity to regulate their emotions and to kind of set aside needs to respond to another. It's like women seem to have
this is kind of across the board.
International, right? This is like, it seems to be part
these are some
of
core innate abilities of women. Okay.
Genetic, physiological, right?
Neat.
So I think what's interesting when you talk about women changing, we're able to see that men change significantly in the connection of marriage and children. Testosterone goes down, they become more attuned, and testosterone is a very important hormone.
Yes.
But it's also a very independent kind of hormone. And so in coming down, they live 7 years longer when they're married on average. They're less inclined to take high risks. They become more oriented toward other human beings when they are in the work of caring for children. When they live with children, when they're with a spouse, they tend to do that.
Interesting.
And so we can see sort of more measurable, if you will, like changes in men. But women, what's interesting about women is, I think when we look at other mammals, so there's lots of tests on little rodents and what happens when a mother gives birth.
Okay.
And you'll see actually brain capacity expand. Now, every mother knows you feel like you've become dumb all of a sudden, right?
It's like, what have we just gotten ourselves into? What's that?
Yes. And it's so intensive and requires so much focus of that brain just to facilitate survival.
Yes.
That it will feel like the web connections in the brain kind of hone in. And I think that's what's happening. And they're expanding. So like rodent mothers who had more than one child show broader kind of links in the brain, more web mapping across parts of the brain when they've given birth and nurture life and care for life and raise life.
Well, I mean, that makes sense when even when you have that sole responsibility of providing, sustaining life to something else. It's almost like you have to do whatever it takes to learn whatever you can to sustain that, and the risks of not learning certain things are so high that maybe I don't know, maybe that's why the brain is like, we have to, like we have to learn.
I think you described it so well, right? Like the survival instinct is oriented towards the survival of another soul on whom they depend fully. They depend
fully on you, yeah.
So I love, it's really interesting to look at what happens to a mother, just if we measure how much mothers learn. So I'll have students sometimes say, well, and I get this feeling. You come home, you're not engaged in the workplace. You might feel like you're not having as many stimulating conversations.
With adults. With
adults, right. All real, all important to recognize. At the same time, when I ask my students, tell me the things your mother learned in the process of nurturing you. And we just unpack that. Child development, geometry, she's honing those skills, right? Nutrition, figuring out how to feed, what's essential for nutrition, how to help people sleep, how to be a therapist to them, right? And what it invites, it's why my mom would say, she had her degree, but she would say, I did not even begin learning until I had children. And all of a sudden, there's this soul that you care so deeply about, and your learning then takes on far more meaning.
And depth, and it's not just, hey, learn this, you can take the test for it. It's, if you don't learn this, your child's success or well-being is at stake.
Yes.
There's such a motivation.
Yes, there's like this high purpose in it, right?
Yes.
So Petrim Sorokin, who helped found Harvard's sociology program in the 1950s, he was a survivor of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, just a remarkable story. But he would say, it is the mother, father, child school, he would call it, is the most democratic of all schools, because it invites the highest forms of kind of engagement in development for adults, because
that makes sense.
These people need them to grow, develop, survive, right?
Wow, that's really neat and very powerful, and also really hard to see as we see the family dynamics and relationships become so severed over decades.
Yes. I mean, that's far more fracturing, right? Yeah. Of the connections that really facilitate development and bring meaning and engagement. So there's a lot to be said for mothers, fathers. I love this story. There was this remarkably talented writer, Marjorie Williams, 2000s. I need to remember the year that she passed away. She gets diagnosed with cancer. People would say she knew more about Washington politics than anyone else inside the Beltway. She was a phenomenal political analyst and could observe what was going on and make commentary about it, talented in every way. She's diagnosed with terminal cancer. And as I think she was 40.
Oh, so young.
Young. Had 2 children. Her last post that she writes is not about what was going on in the Beltway. You can imagine it was about her children. Wow. And so she describes, it's Halloween. She can't help them go out. She helps them put on their costume and their face and all the things, the makeup. And that was her last writing. So Mary Eberstadt, who writes about this, says, for those who learn, that life is a short candle. Right? For those of us who experience that in mortality, learn not that, children are everything, but children are the only thing. So when it comes right down to life and what we as human beings will find as the most significant, meaningful, there is no question it's going to be found in the core relationships of our lives. That mother-child relationship, that father-mother relationship, that father-child relationship. We're going to find this is not just everything. It is, in the end, the only thing, the thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is so, so powerful. So powerful. And I wish people could understand the depth of that.
Yes.
Because that's not what is being messaged right now.
Yes.
It's why would you even have kids when you have this career that could give you this, 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 and this?
Yes.
They're not seeing the depth of what of what they could be missing in their life, depending on these huge choices that they're making.
Yeah.
Wow.
You're right. So we have this dramatic drop in the marriage rate. It is, last year, University of Chicago research, this is just a few months ago, the single strongest discriminator in happiness in the United States is marital status. So that just means that the likelihood of being very happy is the strongest predictor is marriage. So being married is a really big deal.
Is the strongest predictor of if someone's going to...
Is the discriminator between those who are happy and those who are not.
Wow.
And so in looking at this data, what was interesting is at the very same time, out came a report looking at what parents cared about in terms of their children.
Okay.
And it showed, what are you worried about? Well, like 88% said they really cared about their children becoming independent financially, being able to provide and having some success in their career. Okay. Valuable, right?
Yes.
The part that was fascinating is it was only 20% of parents who said they cared that same amount about their children marrying and having children.
Interesting.
So parents really worried about these children growing up being independent and financial career, and much more ambivalent or
whether they choose to take, to have children or not.
Yes.
And yet from the research, we're showing that happiness and meaning in life come from exactly that.
Yes, you're exactly right. So in response to that, David Brooks at the New York Times, a writer for the New York Times, gifted writer, and I'll give a little bit of his background, but he finds himself, he'll describe before he wrote his second book called The Second Mountain.
Okay.
Talented, super talented man. He describes on the eve of getting an award, a big award for his writing, comes home to an empty apartment in New York that he had not eaten dinner with anyone in for some months. He and his wife were divorced recently. The children were gone. And he said, I couldn't even find like a place setting to eat dinner that night. And for him, it was such an awakening to, I've reached the top of the ladder in the meritocracy culture.
Yes.
Right? You don't get higher than David Brooks.
Than him.
Right?
Yeah.
And sensing the emptiness.
The loss.
And so he, in his response to parents' desires, he said, I want to take people by the lapels. Okay, this is his strong language in the New York Times, and say, do not focus on the things that will matter most. Don't ignore the focus on marriage, these core relationships that will mean so much in your life, for something else. Because then he says, all good things you will find will flow from the strength of those relationships. So here's a man who's lived it, right?
He's done it. He's climbed the corporate ladder. He's gotten to the top. He has, quote, quote, all the success that anyone would ever dream of.
Yes.
And yet he's
recognizes when it comes down to it, it's our connections as human beings. It's the webs of those connections beginning with those core relationships, because nothing quite does what marriage does. Yeah. We're trying to figure that out. We're trying to figure out how can we create
this without actually being married.
Without marriage. Yes. And just the data is more strong than ever that there is something unique in what marriage does in bridging the divide between men and women, imbuing their lives with meaning, connection, unity. And it is the irreplaceable institution for the development of children. So 100%. All the data on family structure is going to show, and I mean it's more strong than ever. Here is data coming out. University of Maryland woman who would identify herself as Melissa Carney would identify as a liberal Democrat who is enthusiastic about addressing the poverty needs of children. And yet she says you cannot not look at all of the data and not see that there is something very distinct about a two-parent family. And we are creating a widening gap, class gap, that we will never be able to heal unless we address that fundamental reality. That is that children who grow up in married families end up more likely to have married families themselves.
Yes.
There's a tremendous accumulation of wealth, education that then facilitates a spiraling up, multi-generational, and the other direction. So
my question is, if this is so well researched,
documented,
why are there so many institutions right now trying to destroy the nuclear family?
Undermine that reality. And I'm sure, Aurora, I am sure there has been pain from relationships, right? There's no question that I think there's an ambivalence around several things. One is, am I given the strength of this child bond and the need for children, and the fact that I have to leave the workforce in some ways, which will compromise those achievements? There's an ambivalence about it, right? Like,
Yes.
Is this a good thing to do? Is this safe for me to do?
Yes.
Is this healthy for me to do? And I think those are all questions we have to wrestle with. That's why an equal partnership is so important, that recognizes the distinct offerings, right?
Of each
parent. Yes. Including the irreplaceable maternal sensitivity that's fundamental for children's development, especially in the early years.
And can I ask really quick, you were talking about daycare.
Yes.
Can you, while we're talking about this, can you go a little bit into that, or like what you saw specifically in that regard?
Yeah, so happy to talk about. That's important to talk through, and I think it's part of this wrestle, right?
Yeah,
that
like
data is part of this wrestle.
What do we do? How do we navigate this? And I feel like especially I know a number of moms that are like, oh, well, I'd love to stay home. I can't.
Yes.
In so many regards, and then there's some that are feeling very, very unhappy in the role as mother, because we have society has shamed for a while at this point, saying, but you're not contributing. You're not contributing to society unless you are working.
Yes.
So it's so complex.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors, right, that are part of this story. So I think it is more complex than just people trying to destroy, right, that institution. Yeah. I think there's unpacking what's going on that's shaping this. And so, for example, in the data on daycare, that's a really important question to ask, right? Does it matter?
Yeah.
Is there any difference for children who spend lots of hours in daycare versus those who don't? Yeah. And so when I launch into that extensive review of that data, there was no question it was complex across the 80s as women are increasing their workforce. And some data said no, some said yeah. And so what happened is the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, what we call the NICHD, the nation's kind of research arm for childhood, launches a massive study. They're going to figure this out, right? What does daycare do to kids?
Yes.
And so they launched that in the early 90s, and I'm studying the findings in the mid 2000s as part of my PhD program. And what was fascinating is they took this group of nearly 2,000 children. They're going to measure. They had to do it well done, right? Because there had been complex findings before.
Yes.
They've got to do everything they can to get the best data.
It was thorough? Do you feel like this was
very thorough?
Okay.
Right. There's not been a study like it.
Wow.
Since then, even though other studies might hone in on other pieces more so.
This was taking in consideration backgrounds of these children and socioeconomic statuses, everything.
All of that.
Okay.
Yes. So they're looking at caregivers in the daycare setting. They're looking at homes, families, parents. They're looking at when they go to school. So they track, it's a longitudinal data set that's going to look at them for the first 18 years of their life.
Yes. Wow.
And so interesting, because when the first numbers come out, when these infants are like 9 months old, 12 months old, it looks like not a big deal, right? Children who entered daycare at 6 weeks and those who stayed home, we don't see a big difference.
Okay.
2.5 years, there's some small differences that show up in terms of social relationships, where those who had been in daycare from early age had more complex or more behavioral challenges in their relationships as 2.5 year old. Okay. By age 3, it looked like, those have disappeared, right? No differences.
Okay.
And some were celebrating, right? It was like, oh, good. Women don't need to feel guilty about not being with their children. Yeah, and it's a really important question to kind of unpack, right? But by age 4.5, this is as children are entering kindergarten, like the last testing before they're going to be going into kindergarten. Okay. There was a very significant difference.
Interesting.
And it wasn't in the cognitive stuff. It wasn't the language skills.
I mean, they say like character, like the child's character development is what at age 4, right?
It's That's interesting. Yeah, being shaped.
Yeah, being shaped.
What they found is that the increase in likelihood for a child to show externalizing behavior problems went from like 9% for children who are in less than 10 hours per week of daycare to 35% for those children who were in 35 or more hours per week in daycare.
Wow.
So it was
that's a significant
jump. And it's looking at kind of behavioral, it would be like aggressive, biting, fighting, right, kinds of behaviors that a child was more likely to be in that at risk, or like problematic range, if they had entered daycare within the first year of life and had persistently high enrollment in daycare. High enrollment would be 30 or more hours per week. So what we find out is there seems to be an increased risk for a child who enters early.
And they stay in there.
And stay, yes, for long hours away from primary caregivers, which in most cases is mother.
Yes.
And so those findings were hard, right? Because then it looked like, oh, right, does that mean moms have to stay home with babies? And I think the takeaway is we are deeply relational human beings. And our ability to understand relationships, to experience them in healthy ways, to regulate the stress in our own selves in that relational development is strengthened by a high quality environment. Okay, and what we mean by when we measure quality, it's one adult to 2 or 3 children who care about that child, who want to listen to them, who want to read to them and interact with them and create a safe environment for emotional development. That this is what it means to be a human being. It's what we need.
And it's that attention.
It's the attention.
That attention
yes.
that a child needs.
Yes. From a responsive, caring human being.
So would you differentiate that not just, oh, this is a kind human versus they love you as a person?
Yes.
Is that kind of what you're trying to say?
I don't think you can, right? We all know. So it's interesting. You'll have this question asked now. We are in a post-marriage world. That will be kind of the conclusion. Can we, here's the question, Isabel Sahil from Brookings Institute, can we create a child-centered culture in a post-marriage world? And what we find out is nothing, no institution
can replace that.
Invites parents to devote their time, money, and talent and love in the nurturing of other souls. Nothing more than marriage does that.
Wow.
And so we don't have
another option.
We don't have, and of course we would be like, but of course, because the connection that you feel with those you have helped bring to life, or those you've worked so hard to adopt, right, or care for in some way, like that is a unique relationship inherently.
Yes.
That invites the investment, the giving, the care, the concern, right?
Yes.
In the others, I love that language. They are the others of myself.
Yeah, they're part of you.
They are part of me.
Wow. Yes. That's, and I think for a long time we've been trying as a society to find another option. Yeah. Well, what's the other option?
Yeah.
And from what you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, there is no other option.
There is
that works better.
No.
Than marriage.
And that's not to say every marriage is good or that there's not abusive dynamics that happen.
Yes.
That happens. But when we look at the broad sociology, broad groups of the population, there's just nothing that compares to marriage. And that's comparing cohabitation is not the same. Even if you're living together and bearing the children, you're living with the children that you gave life to, it's not the same. There's the stability of those kind of relationships is much less than a marriage relationship. Wow. There is something about the committed, devoted, right, before witnesses, like this commitment made before others and witnesses, right, that brings an investment, that stabilizes, that creates the structure, that creates the commitment in which individuals can be known and seen and loved.
Yes.
And that's what human beings need for flourishing. To be known, to be seen, and to be loved. Yes.
And to realize that the idea of marriage has been around since the beginning of time.
Yes.
This isn't something that's a modern phenomenon that exists in one culture.
Yeah.
This is throughout throughout cultures, throughout generations of time. And yet I think we're trying to replace something that isn't
irreplaceable.
Yeah, it is irreplaceable.
It's why you're almost quoting this anthropology professor at Harvard who will say it is the most primeval of human institutions.
Wow.
It is this coming together, man, woman, in a committed relationship that is sexual, through which children are conceived, and the binding together of that mother, father, child, and sexual intimacy is core. Is right?
Core to that. Wow. So with daycare, you went to age 4. What did you see? Did you see anything? I'm just curious, like after that, or what did the data show?
The differences persisted. Those same differences that were identified at age 4.5 persisted across development. So by age 15, children who had spent extensive hours in daycare early in life were more likely to have high-risk behaviors, right? Engaging in things that were more dangerous to them, and less social emotional kind of stability.
And I'm just wondering, with having research like this and statistics like this, my question is, why then is the government pushing for more childcare at a younger age and more prevalent? If the data is showing, is it maybe because as a society we really are only valuing the educational, cognitive level outcome? Is that really, we're favoring that? We're not seeing the other side of it? Like why do you think that? Because it seems like it's going against the data and that is a very strong push, right? To be like, hey, we should be able to have kids have, access to free daycare up, starting at this age and do,
it's why I was writing quite a bit about this during the proposal, right, to expand government daycare extensively during the early years of the Biden administration. Right. And it does seem, I do think inherently it's a denial of what the findings are. I think in the name, and it is appreciating the complex question, right? Because you have several things going on. You have low-income families who can't, that mother has to work.
Yes.
Who need a quality environment in which their children can grow up, and be raised by other people, right? In healthy daycare settings. I get that. But it's not being pushed by them, actually. They would prefer, I think when we look at that group of people, they would tend to prefer money as opposed to access to daycare that would allow them to decide.
To decide if I'm going to be the one with my child.
Yes. So if we're trying to think of how to best help those who are working class families, lower income families, if we listen to what they're saying,
what they want,
it's not a massive expansion of government daycare that's sort of a one size fits all. And I think more wisely, we would target low income working class families to provide access to high quality care situations, but then they would prefer to be able to make those decisions. We would expand their ability to make decisions that they feel are best for their families.
That makes a lot of sense. And I mean, maybe at that point, even if the mom needed to work, maybe she would rather pay her sister to watch her child instead of a daycare experience or something like that.
Yeah, it just expands their ability to figure out, I know this child, I know what my circumstances are, and this is what I think would be best.
Yes.
As opposed to a massive expansion of daycare, which is really, it feels like it just feels like a denial of what we know from the data. Now, not all children are at increased risk. Yeah. Some, and we can see some children are more susceptible by nature, by personality, to being more negatively impacted in being
through that
environment than other children are. And so it's not like inherently, right?
It's not if this happens, therefore this is the absolute result.
Yes, right.
Yes.
And I think also recognizing that the amount matters. So it's not that any daycare is inherently harmful to children.
Yes.
It's the early
How
extensive,
is
this? And over a period of years that seem to be linked with a dramatic increase in risk. And so I think it's appreciating, and what's so interesting is across the 80s, 90s, the data has been very consistent in terms of what women prefer to do in terms of work and family. So this would be my PhD work. And what you find out is that women with young children at home, the majority, far and away, prefer part-time or no employment to full-time employment. So when I'm gathering all of my data, the biggest gap between what women wanted to be doing and what they were doing was for those who are working full-time and did not want to be working full-time. So we have a huge chunk of women who are working far more than they want to be working. So as you said, we like economically and just the expectation of a two household income, right? 2-income household.
Yes.
Then you have a lot of women feeling like they are in a situation where they are constrained to work far more than they want.
That makes, I mean, that makes sense. And maybe it's also a lot of societal pressures, right? Where I don't know if there's a lot of moms that that feel comfortable saying like, you know, I want to be home.
Yes.
You know, I want to raise my own kids, because at this point it's like, okay, so what do you do? And if you say like, oh, I stay at home, it's like, so what else do you do?
Yes.
You know, there's so much pressures each side. I mean, it's so hard. It is so hard.
I love that it was Anne Marie Slaughter. So she was working under Hillary Clinton in the State Department, just underneath her, really high position. She was a dean at Princeton in poli-sci. And out comes this Atlantic article. It's the most widely shared Atlantic article in history.
Oh.
And it was written by Anne Marie Slaughter. And it was all about her decision to leave the State Department because she had an adolescent boy who was struggling. And she writes about that decision. The title of it is No Women Cannot Have It All, something like that. And she describes how she had been a woman who would say, you can have it all.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And then she finds out in her own journey, and these are adolescent boys who can take care of themselves.
Yes.
Right?
These are not infants at this point.
These are not infants. Her husband he's a professor at Princeton as well, has a flexible job. He can be there. She says the decision to leave the State Department was reflexive, meaning I didn't even have to think about it. This child needed me. And I could not deny that I had a special role in helping facilitate his health and well-being than somebody else. Wow. And so she just said how it shaped her. She'll say, we give nannies, we give everybody the short shift, right? She said, I used to go into situations and be the one who was like, well, what are you doing if you're not out in the workplace?
Yeah.
Right? And now just seeing how important it was to honor those reflexive decisions that come from the gut within a woman that says, I know where I am needed.
Yes.
And I need support culturally, right? To validate that this really is the most significant work in life. And so she's gonna say that and be one who kind of champions, right? Our shifting from making workplaces changing our workplaces to cause families to be work friendly, right? That's what we've done. We've had this this make our families friendly to work.
Yes.
To making our workplaces truly friendly to family.
And that dichotomy change, that's huge.
Isn't that interesting? Because it places at the core, like what is it that leads to human flourishing? It's strong relationships.
Yes. And we have that opposite right now.
We have it upside down.
Yeah.
I think that's right. Like it's flipped upside down, that we should, families need to be accommodating all of these work interests.
Yes.
Right. As opposed to framing our society around what is it that really helps human beings do well.
Human beings. And I feel like there's so many things that could be implemented potentially in the workforce for mothers. Yes. Right? Where there's a lot of growth that can happen in that regard. If moms have to work. I mean, because the reality is, even if women and men are working the same hours, women are still generally taking on the primary caregiver role when they come back to the home. Yes. And so there is just so much more pressure on moms. And I have a good friend, and she works full time and is a mom and is pregnant. And she was just saying, her company was asking everyone, if you are a unique situation, please contact us and all this stuff. And so all of these different, LGBTQ and everything. And she wrote in and was like, hey, this is my situation. And I do feel unique. I am not surrounded by many other people in my situation where I'm a mom and I'm, pregnant and we're going through this, everything. And they completely denied her application.
Wow.
No, she's like, that's really interesting, because it's like, oh, okay, well, we'll consider this, but it was just completely, she was just completely sidelined in that regard. And I was like, man, that is so that's sad when they're, it's like, okay, if all voices are going to be heard, let's hear all voices, you know? So.
Yeah. And the paradox, right, or is maybe in the last year, it's been remarkable to me. There's almost every week some article published in an elite source, New York Times, The Atlantic, Washington Post, about our fertility crisis.
Yes.
And it's really remarkable.
What are your thoughts on this? So, I'm really curious.
Yeah, watching that response is fascinating because we've had an impending fertility crisis for decades, right? Maybe even since the 1970s. But for a long time, it's been not a big deal. Maybe it's better to have fewer people, right? Maybe it's better you can hear that strong message, right? It's better for the planet if we have fewer, and maybe for families, it's better if they can focus in on just a couple of children. And now there's no question we have an impending serious situation globally, because we are not replacing ourselves, and we estimate that by 2050 the world at large will be in population decline.
And some countries are further ahead on the spectrum than others, right? And we're seeing what's happening to these countries, and yet I was hearing that we're, at one point people just thought, the natural default of the human psyche is to have on average, 2 point whatever,
right,
3 kids, on average, that's just
something over the replacement of 2.1.
Yeah, like that's just what people are going to choose. And it's like, actually, that's not true.
What people are choosing, that's right.
And I don't know if you've heard this or if you know more about it, but I've heard one of the biggest deciding factors of a woman to choose to get pregnant is if she sees women around her.
Yes.
Getting pregnant.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a huge deciding factor. And even in that regard, it's like, okay, so are we showing that in the media? Right. Are we showing pregnant women in the media? Are we showing that this is, and we're really not, right? Because we're showing a different lifestyle of why would you choose that path, right? When you could have X, Y, and Z,
Yes. No, so Tim Carney just published his book out of American Enterprise Institute about this question. And I think for a long time, there's been like, well, people are just more selfish, or then you'll hear the money issue, right? People can't afford to have children. That's what you might hear from my students. And he just, lots of interviews, lots of economic analysis, just comes to the conclusion, it's not about people being more selfish. It's not about money. It's really a whole cultural orientation that is not toward life. And he'll describe when people came home from war, in World War II, we had this huge population increase because like a bump in fertility because you had people marrying.
Yes.
But he said there was a sense that humans were good. That life was good. We'd overcome something very hard and wrong. Yes. And there was a right to give one's life for and a hope.
Yes.
And he'll sense it's like human beings no longer feel that there's like a goodness in bringing life, right? Wow. In enabling life. And so it's sort of and I think that's painful when we think of a dramatic increase in the suicide rate, especially among some segments of the population. Yes. That it's the most common source of death for men in a certain age. And then a decrease like 1.7, 1.8 decrease beneath replacement, right? Then what we're seeing is a culture that's not life-giving, life-valuing, life-supporting. And what does that say
about
what does
society?
It say about us? Yes.
And are you saying this is mostly in the United States? Or are you saying this is like getting to the global scale?
It's a global scale. So you have Western Europe has typically led the decrease in fertility. Right. But we now see the sharpest declines in fertility are in those parts of the world, South America, India. Obviously, China's in a now, right, they can't deny a significant fertility problem economically. Imminent. But I think what's interesting is we sort of thought, oh, well, it'll be okay because immigration will compensate for our decreased fertility rate. But in fact, it's those segments of the population that are decreasing even more dramatically at a rate that's more dramatic.
Wow.
And so it is a global, there's no question, it's a global issue.
Concern that
global
this is
concern. Happening. And what does it mean for economies? Because economies really are composed of human capital, which is number of people and their skill level. Right. And we actually see like a decrease in people actually is consistent with a decrease in skill level as well. Because when you have kind of a life-oriented culture that's oriented towards the future, which is children,
yes,
then development and
is
what do we do
focused on
now? Yes. For the future, it builds innovation, it builds investment, creativity. There's a hope,
yes,
right? That invites the younger working class that we really depend on, which is like our 20s and 30s, the brilliant minds.
To be
right?
pushing that forward.
To be pushing that forward.
And that's just not happening.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think Silicon Slopes just recently said there's been a drop in the 20-year-olds. We used to have all of these companies with like really rising stars in their 20s, and that's totally dropped out. Now, some of that is because men are floundering. Men are, right, the gap of women's achievement over men in terms of academics, degrees, actually is greater than it was flipped the other way before women had access to education in the 1970s.
That's happened?
That's happened.
Wow.
And we have this growing percentage of men who are working age that we used to rely on. This is our most working eligible group. They're working age men who are not working. So you have a growing proportion of them who are neither working nor going to school. And so that just suggests there's like an innervation, there's a drop in the desire to grow, develop, invest in life,
to
care for
perpetuate
others.
In that natural human consistency.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
So it is a lot to figure out, like, what are we doing with so much, right? In some ways, so much more comfortable.
Yes. Like we're at such a point. Yeah. I mean, it's the world at large is experience a different level of prosperity. Right?
Yes. That's
I mean, I'm not saying every country, but I'm just saying, in this time of the world versus others.
Yes.
And what are we doing with that?
What are we doing with
that extra time? Because so much of what we've been given has given us extra time. Leisure time. I know from statistics that there has never been a point in human history that people have had more leisure time than they do now. And it's like, and what are we doing with it?
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Where there's like at the same time, like a despairing about the value of life underneath. Yeah.
Wow. So what are your thoughts of what will
help
what is
with
your
that?
And what is your prediction on like what if nothing changes, what's the future?
Yeah.
For our kids or maybe our grandkids.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are challenging. That's challenging, right? It's interesting to think about this fascinating work. Carl Zimmerman out of Harvard, 1950s, 1960s, his magnum opus of his life was to look at the rise and fall of civilizations across time. So, right, the great empires, Assyria, Babylon, Greece, Rome, European empires. And he was, as a sociologist, was tracking where is the place of the family in this, like, and what you watch is a clan, right? We see Rome taken over by clan structures. Every time it was a clan, family clan that came in. And then you saw this rise in development, prosperity, creativity, innovation. And at the peak of it, he would say, in every case, it was the orientation of that society to the nurturing of children.
I don't know if this was the exact
same
Zimmerman
kind of,
was, but they were looking into similarities of why civilizations were collapsing, and it was when they stopped protecting the innocence of children. And I was like, oh, that's so, but right, you would be protecting the next generation of how do we make sure that this generation has the best chances of success, not just cognitively, right? In all aspects. Right. And I also found that fact.
That's a
they
beautiful
go
way
together,
to describe it.
Right?
Yep,
they go together. And I don't know if it was, I'd have to go back and remember where.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way of describing, I think, what he finds, just that orientation towards the nurturing of children. Right, is part of that protection of the innocence. It's a recognition of their developmental needs. And how do you create a culture that is really facilitative of that, oriented to that?
Yes. And how that's currently right now is being exploited on so many levels.
Yes. Kind of lost that orientation. And that's what he saw. He saw, right, you moved from clan to familistic to what he called atomistic, where it was the individual, right, is seen as kind of the primary culture is oriented around
the individual instead of the family unit. Yeah. And I had researched that back in college and had seen some of these studies. And it was fascinating to see that and to see, these thriving civilizations, and they change something seemingly something subtle, right? What they focus on. Is it the family unit or is it the individual? And when they shifted to the individual over not a super long amount of time, the society and the civilization craters.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of weight to that. And do we understand globally how important that is?
Yes.
I mean, and are we not looking back on history to see what's happened throughout time, to see these consistent patterns?
Yes.
And so it's
it's a lot. It's significant, right? I mean, I think you've captured it, that it's really being clear about what it is to be a human being.
Yeah.
And that's why these core relationships are so fundamental. It's why a mother and a father, and they're being mapped onto these children, investing in them. It matters because that's who we are as human beings.
Yeah. And
relational.
Having that connection is stronger than almost anything else. I mean, you think of what a mom would do for the safety of her child, at the expense of herself. And the concern I see in multiple different governments is this true deciding factor of trying to sever that. So you see certain governments that are outright saying, and these are first world countries that are saying the child actually doesn't belong to the mom. The child is property of the state, of the government. Yes. And that is very, very, that should be concerning at a very, very deep level to everyone. Yeah. Because so you can't come in and sever that. And that's what they're trying to do. Right. So
I think our Western Europe, just Nordic countries, and I think most of us who've been in graduate school would have experienced the Nordic countries being held up as a model. So, because there's a year of paid leave for a mother in Norway or Sweden. And I think what is interesting about that, and you'll hear this also described, is two things. One is it removes choice from the mother, because after that year, you absolutely would not stay home with your children. You have an obligation to put into the system. You are a contributing part of this socialist structure.
Interesting.
And you are, you would just be a renegade.
Right. It's like, well, we gave you all this time off.
Yes.
Oh, I have not thought about the flip side of that.
That the choice piece that then is compromised. And the other piece that's really interesting, you'll hear people talk about, is that parents have lost a sense that they know how to parent children. So there can be this they'll know better. The daycare worker would know better. The teacher would know better. And a decreased sense of confidence
as the
parent to know what it means to help this child grow. And I think you just got back to that. This primal core relationship, where it is literally the other of myself.
Right.
There isn't anything that can provide a more informed, knowledge, understanding.
And care, and the foundational of love with that. And I remember you saying, you had been to the United Nations. I was there in 2018, but just this year, I have a few women that I know, and what's happening even right now is shocking.
Yeah.
And I wish there was a better way to bridge what's happening on this elitist level, and this huge chasm from the civilian, right? All of us is, and there's such a broad gap of information, right? Of what's happening at this level and what we understand of what's happening. And there's a lot of this unpaid care worker, which they won't term as moms, but there's I'm having a good friend of mine. She wrote, her name is Kimberly Els. She wrote The Invincible Family.
Yeah, I know Kimberly.
That. Yeah, and there's some beautiful things that we can do as moms.
Yes,
to make sure that our children and society can have stability.
Yeah.
and have this chance of this next generation being raised in a way that they can truly be successful on all levels, right? Not just intellectually, because from what we're understanding that they're not deeply and happily fulfilled. And then that creates all sorts of other problems. And so I love everything that you've shared. I'm so grateful that you've been able to help us in so many different regards, understand the research on so many things and why we've gotten to this point, and the reasons why we got here. Do you have any, as we wrap up, do you have any encouragement that you would want to give to a mom that's listening right now?
Yeah, it's tearful to think about, right? Because mothers are so, just thinking of the intensity of the feeling of responsibility that can be heavy, the intensity of the love and wanting to protect and do things right and do things perfectly, and knowing that you will fail. You can't, it's bigger than we are. It's bigger than a mother is. And yet, what an incredible privilege to walk into that space where you have the opportunity to know and love and see a human being at that level. And that's what the meaning is. So I love how William Kotz will say, perfection is not possible. Intimacy is.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And motherhood is this most unspeakable privilege of having a deep, intimate connection with another soul. No relationship quite like it. And to take with it all that means. Sometimes the burden, the responsibility, the feeling of failure, the not knowing what does it mean to take care of myself in this relationship.
Yes.
And just knowing it will be messy, I am sure. And that each woman's path may look different from another woman's path.
True.
But at the core is this, right? There is no other relationship like it. What a privilege to walk into that messy space and have the opportunity for that level of intimacy and influence. There's nothing like it. There is no more influential place
in the world
than
that of a mother.
Yes. Yep. True.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful for your time. I'm so grateful that you were
so grateful for you, Aurora.
You're being here and willing to show up and encourage and support and educate all of us that are yearning to understand better of what's going on. So thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you. Bless you in the work you're doing.